Hello everyone, Pulse here, and welcome to another episode of Delving Deep, ESO. Now in this episode we're going to keep on trucking with our discussion on these skill lines that will be available in Elder Scrolls Online, and since we've finally covered all of the classes and the skill lines associated with them, I think it's time we move on to the weapon skill lines. Now I've decided in order to keep this video from being monstrously long, I'm going to actually split it into 3 weapon types per video, with this first weapon themed episode aimed at the up close and personal weapon types, two-handed weaponry, one-handed and a sword, and finally the dual wielding skill line. Now before I begin, let me reiterate some things that I've had to tell you guys in the previous videos when it comes to things pertaining to the skill lines, and that is that these skills are not confirmed in any way, or any official capacity anyway, by Zenimax Online, and it's more of a collective of information and that really come from beta testers and forum goers and game followers. And in all honesty, when you just look at all the evidence that's pointing towards the skill lines, it seems to be 100% legit at this point, and I'm actually surprised Zenimax hasn't just come out and said, you know what, you guys leaked it, and well, we're not changing it very much, so there you go. There's your skills. Let's make it official. Second, I'm going to do my very best to stay away from just plain numbers. I'm sure I'll slip up at some point, but I just wanted to keep in mind with you guys that the numbers in MMOs are not concrete, and it doesn't matter if it's damage, duration, ability cost, or whatever else. These numbers can and will change. Second, you can't take them into account in any concrete way, as I was saying, because we don't know how a number is substantial in the way that the game is balanced. So for example, I can say the number 5. Number 5 is a small number to most people, but maybe in the Elder Scrolls Online universe, 5 is a substantial number. Maybe 3000 is a weak number, maybe 1 is good. We don't know because we haven't had time to play with the game. Now, next, I want to say that percentages will most likely be mentioned during the skill lines, mainly because I feel that they give a better context to the skills themselves and can help us understand the potential purpose and what Zenimax was thinking when they implemented the skill in these ways. Definitely a lot better than plain numbers do. So now I'm done blabbing. Let's get on away from the boring stuff and the rambling. Let's get on to the actual skill lines. And we're going to start off today with the two-handed skill line. Now, the two-handed skill line starts off with the active ability of Cleave. This is going to be, as you would expect, just doing some physical damage to all enemies in front of you, but it's also going to have a bleed for about 10 seconds. Like I said, don't take the durations, but it's going to do a little bit of damage over about a 10-second window, so it's just going to be a little bit of instant AoE damage with a little bit of bleed tacked onto all of those hit. Now the next ability is Critical Charge. This is going to have a good bit of range on it, and it's going to, as you would expect again, charge to the target and attack them, doing a little bit of damage. The extra bit on it though is that you're always going to do a critical hit when you use this ability on your target, as long as they don't have something to ward off the damage, obviously. I feel like it's a little bit interesting, but I'm not sure how it's going to work because charge abilities are used almost always for the mobility factor, so we'll have to see if it comes down to a weird balancing thing where people are just using critical charge at point blank range for the critical damage or something. Let me see. The next ability is called Uppercut. This, unlike the 2 previous, are not an instant, and it is actually going to be about a 1-second cast time. And after that cast time, you're going to do a substantial amount of damage to the enemy. You're going to stun them for a couple seconds, and you're going to knock them back. This is a powerful ability for sure. The 1-second cast time, or however long the cast time is by the time the game comes out, is obviously there to offset that. We'll have to see how they balance it around. I could see 1 second is not very long in terms of this, so we'll see how that gets changed. I wouldn't be surprised at all if that gets like a longer time of a casting or something like that. Now the next ability here is called Reverse Slash. This is just going to do a pretty small amount of damage, but it's going to do a substantial amount of an increase in damage based on the target's missing health. So this is an ability kind of similar to the other execute styles from the other like class abilities that we've seen, but it's cool to see it on a weapon as well, so you can maybe double up on that ability to just wreck somebody below like 25% health. This is going to be something you're not going to use right from the get-go at like 100% health on the enemy. You're going to wait till you get to a certain threshold where the math just adds up in a really nice way, and you can just wreck face with reverse slash and burn somebody down very quickly. Now the final active for the two-handed skill line is called Momentum. This is going to be a self buff, which is going to increase weapon damage by a good percentage for about half a minute or so. But in addition to that, for every couple seconds that goes by, the bonus to weapon damage is further increased. So for example, they have 10% weapon damage increase for 20 to 30 seconds, and then you're going to have 2% to 3% for every couple seconds that goes by. So you're looking at in somewhere between 15 to 25% increase if you have this ability on you. So you're just going to wreck face when you have this ability on you. It costs a good bit of stamina, but not a substantial amount compared to the other abilities in the skill line, and that's really cool. I like these style abilities that you just kind of, you know what, let's go into berserk mode. Now onto the passive abilities for the two-handed skill line. The first passive is simply called Heavy Weapons. Two-handed weapons grant the following bonuses. Wielding a two-handed axe is going to allow 10% chance to bleed for a little bit of damage over a couple seconds. Mace attacks are going to ignore a good chunk of armor, and using a two-handed sword is just going to provide about 5% additional damage. I'm not sure how I feel about swords kind of just getting plain damage. This is actually a theme you'll see a little bit later in the video. It's looks like swords, they just didn't know what to do special with them, so they left them to do extra damage. But I do like this kind of varying ability depending on what weapon you have, because it could mean that depending on the encounter you actually switch out your weapon, maybe within the same skill line like in this case, but you'll switch it out to do something different. So maybe you're fighting a heavy armored dragon knight with a ton of armor, so you swap out to your two-handed mace or something to offset their heavy armor. Now the next passive is called Balance, and this is just going to reduce the cost of your two-handed abilities by about 20% or so. Fairly bland, but incredibly useful for sure. Now the next one is Sweeping Strikes. This is going to cause your light attacks to deal 25% splash damage to one enemy. Now this is pretty cool. This is kind of making it so that between cleave and sweeping strikes, if I could talk, you can have a substantial amount of AoE possibility with the two-handed skill line equipped. Now the next one is a pretty interesting in my eyes, and it's called Arcane Fighter. This is going to increase the chance for proc style abilities which inflict status effects, so burning and chilling and many others, I'm sure. This is pretty cool. This is not something you'd normally associate with a weapon, in my opinion. It's something you'd normally see like in a class-specific kind of thing. So this is cool. This means there's some possibilities for some, maybe the enchanting, it could affect that, or maybe even some of the class abilities which cause proc style abilities to happen. Now finally we get to Battle Rush, which is the last passive for the two-handed skill line, which is just going to cause killing an enemy to increase stamina regeneration by about 50% for a couple seconds. This is pretty bland in my eyes, but also very powerful. This is typical MMO in my eyes. I mean, overall I have to say that this is just a nice batch of skills, all things considering. It does fit fairly well with like old school kind of tropes a little bit. It definitely reminds me of like old school fantasy warrior play styles with the mix of like armor penetration and bleeding cleaves all kind of jumbled up into one thing. The Arcane Fighter thing, as I mentioned, it doesn't really fit quite with that warrior style, because it does inflict the status effects, which is a little bit odd for the overall kind of theme of the two-handed skill lines, but I think that's pretty cool, and definitely the one that's most interesting to me. I think the skills sound pretty fun though, I have to say. A good portion of the skills look like they would gel quite well with one another, especially if you're going for that berserker playstyle where you kind of engage and with each fight and each kill you are just reinvigorated with more strength and it keeps you going and you're strong in fighting without stopping. It's all very cool, and I could definitely see some people going for that berserker playstyle with the two-handed sword. In fact, I might be one of those running around with a giant-ass greatsword, wrecking people and mobs with just a few good old cleaves of my sword there. Now, the next skill line we're going to talk about is the one-hand and shield combination. Now, the active abilities start off with Puncture, which is going to just do a good chunk of damage. It's going to reduce the target's armor by a substantial amount, and it's going to taunt them for a couple seconds. This is a pretty potent, like, early level skill, I have to say. That's pretty strong, but I like the fact that Zenimax just said, you know what, if you're going one-handed sword, odds are you're trying to be a tank, or you're at least trying to learn how to tank, so let's give you the taunt ability right away. That's very integral to what role this weapon is going to be used for, so why not give it to you straight away. Now the next one is Low Slash. This is going to deal a little bit of damage. It's going to snare the target for about 60% or so, and then it's also going to reduce the target's damage output for about 20% for a couple seconds as well. That's a pretty stacked kind of ability. I mean, even if you removed the damage part of that, that would still be a really powerful and potent skill. So Low Slash, I think, is going to be one of those that are just really, really powerful and used a lot. Now the next one is Defensive Posture. This is, while slotted, and I'm not sure if this is like a misinformation, because it all seems to point towards this slotted idea on the skill, but it says while slotted, increase the armor and spell resistance by a good chunk and decrease your own damage output by about 8 to 10% or so. This one is a little odd. I have to think that it's actually an activated ability because it does have a stamina cost rather, and this is going to be one of those that you can just leave on. Maybe it'll have like an initial stamina cost, but it'll be more like an ongoing self buff, so you don't have to actually activate this all the time. It doesn't have a duration associated with it, but rather it'll be like defensive stance, I believe it's called in WoW, where you just, I'm going to tank right now, I need the extra armor and spell resistance, let me turn on my defensive posture, my defensive stance of sorts, and become extra tanky while this is activated. Then you can turn it back off and maybe go into more of a damage dealing mode, because that does decrease your damage output. Now the next one is called Shield Charge. This is going to charge to the target and deal a little bit of damage while also stunning them. This one has a good bit of range on it, as you would expect. It's just a good bit of sort of tank mobility, which is very reminiscent of like the warrior fantasy style tropes and archetype. That's very typical. It's what I would have expected from the one-handed and shield skill line. Now the next one is called Power Bash. This is going to deal a little bit of damage, but it's most importantly going to disorient the target for a good chunk of seconds for sure. That's a pretty potent CC, and it's something I didn't notice in the two-handed skill line. Not a lot of CC available in that one. Now that brings us to the passives. The first one called Sword and Board, which is going to just increase your damage by a nice bit while you have a one-handed shield equipped, but it's also going to increase your armor. Very kind of bland and typical tanky passive, but useful nonetheless. Now the next one is Deadly Bash, which is going to cause your bash ability to deal 100% extra damage, and it's also going to cost about 20% less stamina. Now, when I saw this, I was a little bit confused, to be honest. I have to think they mean Power Bash from the one hand and shield actives, but I wonder if it also means the kind of bash interrupt that you can do when you hold down both buttons, which is used as you use a good chunk of your stamina and you can interrupt an attack from the opponent if they're in the middle of casting something. I wonder if that's what they mean as well. If it's both, that would just be super cool. I mean, that would be really, really powerful. If it's not, though, the Power Bash alone is a nice enough passive. But because they just mentioned Bash instead of Power Bash, I have to think that this is maybe both versions of the skill where you hold down and interrupt. So that's pretty cool. Now that brings us to Fortress, which is going to just reduce the cost for blocking by about 25%. Incredibly bland, probably one of the blandest skills I've seen thus far throughout our little venture through the skill lines. But you know what, 25% reduced cost when blocking is not bad when you're in a tanking situation. Now Deflect Bolts, while you have a one-handed weapon and shield equipped, you're just going to block 15% additional damage from projectiles and ranged attacks. This is very bland as well, but this one is pretty useful in PvP and PvE. There could definitely be some situations where you need to pull off some like range tanking kind of thing. This doesn't make it so that when you're away like that, you're just getting pounded by range. You can actually stay in the fight from a distance. Now that brings us to the final passive, which is Battlefield Mobility, which is just going to cause movement speed while blocking to have an increase of 50%. Now, I could be wrong on this, and it could have been tweaked, but I thought when you were blocking, you had a reduced movement speed of 50%. So if you're increased, then is this like negating that? Is it only bringing it up to like in between? So would it be like a 75%? Because that's what the mouth would equal up to. I'm not sure where this is standing. If you are able to move at full speed with a block on, that may be a little bit OP. So I'm thinking it's probably the in between at about a 75% of your normal move speed while blocking. The usefulness is still very cool because mobility in general is very powerful in an MMO, no matter your situation really. So that's a pretty nice passive actually if you're into the tanking with a one hand and a shield. Now this is obviously the tank of Elder Scrolls Online, no question about it. If you intend to tank in any capacity, you will more than likely be utilizing this skill line in some form, in some way. As I mentioned when detailing the classes, I said that you could maybe build a non-traditional tank playstyle. Most notably was the mention of like the Nightblade going for a health regen or self-healing tank style. But when you take into account the weapon availability that we have in the game, I'm thinking that this is going to be used pretty much no matter what. I can see people trying to do an unorthodox tank style that doesn't use a one-handed shield, and perhaps they'll be successful in that, but I'll have to wait and see till I pass judgment on that. I definitely see this as being the go-to, mainly because this is the one that has taunt right away. I haven't seen anything else that mentions having a heavy taunt available. This is definitely the only one I can think of off the top of my head. I'm sure someone will let me know if I've already said so in a previous video though. Now all that said though, I do want to give props to Zenimax for making it a little bit more offensive and control themed rather than the typical pop your buffs and turtle up, which is what I would consider old school MMO tank style. There's no question that this is the tank. This has a lot of tank related abilities. However, I can quite easily see people going for like leaving the tank components of the skill line behind and then building themselves for a more offensive sword and board user. I know that's actually one of the like most requested playstyles from people who play MMOs. I honestly, I have to give it to like 300, that movie, for doing that. I swear when that movie came out, I heard more people bitching about how they want to run around with a sword and a spear, or a shield and a spear rather, and a shield and a sword more than any time ever. So I'm gonna give it to that movie as to why they just want to bash people in the face with a shield and still be all like up in your face badass. But the fact remains that this is a pretty offensive style when it comes to like tanking abilities, and because this weapon, or the weapon sort of one-handed shield combo, does have some more offensive capabilities, I can definitely see people trying to go for that some. But that brings me to the final skill line, and potentially it's the most popular of all the skill lines, not just the ones in this episode, and that is Dual Wielding. I'll get into why I think it's going to be the most popular after we go through all the skills though. Now, the first active we have here for the Dual Wielding skill line is called Twin Slashes. This is just going to do 2 hits for a very, very tiny bit of damage, but most importantly, it's going to leave a pretty substantial bleed on the target for a number of seconds. Now, the next ability is called Flurry, which is going to be a small channel ability, which is going to do 6 consecutive hits with the 6th one doing substantial damage compared to the previous 5. This is kind of typical channel melee attack. You can see this quite a bit in Guild Wars. They do this a lot. The warrior in particular has a couple weapons which make you just stand in place and you unleash this ridiculous barrage of damage, and then you go about your way. Now, the next ability is called Whirlwind. This is going to deal a good chunk of damage to all the enemies around you in a 360-degree radius. And then it's also going to do increased damage versus the low health targets. That's pretty cool. You normally don't see the execute style abilities. I keep bringing up that term because that's usually what you call it when you get like the 25% mark. You just do ludicrous damage. You usually don't see that bonus on an AoE, so that's pretty cool. Now, the next one is Sparks. This is a basic blind for a couple seconds. It's really straightforward, and I'm not really sure why it's in the dual wielding skill line because it doesn't have anything to do with the weapons themselves. But I'll get into that a little bit later. I think I have a good theory as to what has happened with this skill line. Now, the final one is called Hidden Blade. This is going to throw a dagger that deals a good bit of damage, but most importantly, it's going to interrupt the target, and we don't have very many skills that allow you to do this, especially from range, so that's really cool. It's really potent in a lot of situations. And also, it has a snare for about 50 seconds, or 50% rather, for a couple seconds. Now that brings us to the passives, the first one being Deathstroke, which is just going to increase damage by about 20% versus targets under 25% health. This kind of goes back to that execute range or execute damaging abilities, which seems to be kind of a trend in this skill line. This is just do tons and tons of damage. Now the next one is called Dual Wield Expert, which is just going to increase offhand weapon damage by about 25%. Now this is, from what I can tell, just the MMO standard of balancing offhand weapons, because usually what happens when you have two weapons, in order to offset damage, for example, when you have both, it almost always starts out at the beginning, you have your main hand weapon does way more damage than the offhand weapon, usually about like 100% on the one hand, and then your offhand weapon about 50%. And then they do something like this where they increase the damage so that it's not so spiky depending on which weapon you're hitting with. That way it's a little bit more easy to balance and theory craft your damage. I'm pretty sure that's what's going on here. They're evening up each hand so that by the end game it's a little bit more easier to understand your actual output potential with those weapons, and it also allows you to play with the weapons you want instead of having to do very peculiar things. Anyone who's played a rogue in WoW or dual wield in WoW will definitely know what I'm talking about there. Now the next passive is called Controlled Fury, which is going to reduce the cost of your dual wield abilities by about 20%. Very potent, very bland, but incredibly useful. Now the next one is called Ruffian. This is going to deal 15% more damage when attacking disabled targets. So if they're stunned, immobilized, disoriented, silenced, and whatever other sort of effects, CCs or what have you, fall under disabled, you're going to do nice damage to them as well. And then finally, that brings us to Twin Blade and Blunt, which is the final passive. So when you have a dual wield weapon equipped, they're going to grant the following bonuses per weapon equipped. This is the most notable part of the skill, so keep that in mind. Axes, 5% chance to deal a little bit of physical damage over 10 seconds in the form of a bleed. The maces are going to deal up to 5% bonus damage to heavily armored enemies. The sword is going to deal 2.5% additional damage across the board, so less situational than the mace and the axe, but overall useful in general. And then the dagger, which is going to increase critical strike chance by 5%. Now again, I want to go back to the per weapon equipped part. So this means to me that you can absolutely pick and choose what you want to use when it comes to the weapons and which hand they're going to be in. In addition, the dagger there at the bottom, this is pretty much the only mention of dagger throughout the skill line, through the classes or anything, and here it is. Here is the weapon a lot of people are going to be using. There's just so many people who want to play the dual dagger assassin style. This is going to be the skill line that makes it very popular to use it. It's definitely going to be because dagger is thrown in with dual wielding. Now, as I said, the dagger is going to really make this skill line very popular, but one of the other reasons I think it's going to be very popular amongst players in Elder Scrolls Online is because it simply appeals to so many different styles of play. It has a ton of flexibility in the skills provided, and the main reason why is because of that dagger at the end there. It's just going to really appeal to the assassin style character that is very popular in fantasy MMOs. Now, overall though, I think this awesome skill line is just that. It's awesome. I found it very impressive simply due to the sheer number of possibilities that it provides. It really seems like Zenimax couldn't quite figure out how to best give players that assassin playstyle that a lot of people are going to want, and instead of separating it so that Nightblade was just the assassin character, which it still kind of has that archetype going about it, instead they kind of threw some of the skills this way towards dual wielding and provided it with daggers so that you can have a nice mix of skills here. And when you read it, it seems odd, but when you kind of just think about the way that skill lines work in Elder Scrolls Online, the fact is that this actually just provides extra utility and customization through the dual wielding skill line. It just seems really, really cool, and the fact is it's all about making your choices. That's the whole point. You can just pick whatever you want, and you can play how you want. Along the same lines though, I also need to mention that I like the fact that AoE wasn't only relegated to two-handed weapons when it came to the weapon skill lines that dealt physical damage. The two-handed weapons had it, and dual wielding has it as well, so there is a nice mix of AoE for those who want to play up close and personal, which is a nice addition there. Now guys, that's going to bring me to the end of this episode of Delving Deep ESO. Today we went over the two-handed weaponry skill line, the sword and board or sword and shield, and the dual wielding skill line, with the remaining three, that being destruction staff, resto staff, and bow, coming very shortly. Now let me know down in the comments below what you think of the skill lines we covered today, and which ones are you interested in using, if at all, on the characters you intend to create for Elder Scrolls Online when we finally get it into our gaming hands. Now I really am torn personally between two-handed sword and dual wielding and bow in the current. I want my runes, but I'm not going to go into that now. I'm sure I've ranted to you guys enough about that weapon type. Now yeah, that'll do it for me, guys. I can't think of anything else. Thanks so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this even a slight bit, by all means, please hit that subscribe button in the corner, throw me down a comment and a thumbs up. That would be really awesome. It'll help the channel grow so I can provide more awesome content for you guys. Make sure to stick to Nova Pulse Gaming for tons more of Elder Scrolls Online coverage, tons more MMO overall, and I will see you on the next one, guys.